To the American doctor, it was just a standard flu shot. But to the young German woman trembling in the Texas exam room, the needle in his hand wasn't medicine. It was a weapon. She backed into the corner, screaming, convinced the U.S. Army was about to sterilize her. She wasn't afraid of the pain. She was afraid of the lie she believed more than her own eyes. But to understand why this moment happened, to truly grasp how the situation became so critical that a routine medical procedure dissolved into a scene of sheer terror, we must go back. We must examine the forces and failures that set this entire chain of events in motion. We have to peel back the layers of a sophisticated psychological operation that turned the history of American medicine into a weapon of war, creating a hysteria so profound that it blinded thousands of people to the reality standing right in front of them. To understand the scream in that Texas exam room, we must first understand the silence of the concentration camps and the dark administrative echoes that connected the Third Reich to the United States in ways history has often tried to forget. This story begins not in Texas, but deep within the ideological machinery of National Socialism. For the German soldiers and civilians who would eventually find themselves in American custody, their worldview had been shaped by a decade of indoctrination that viewed biology as destiny. The Nazi regime did not merely practice politics, it practiced what they called applied biology. The state had assumed total control over the physical bodies of its citizens. By the time the Second World War began, the concept of bodily autonomy had been eradicated in Germany, replaced by the cold, hard metrics of racial hygiene. The German soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe, and the civilians who fell under Allied occupation, carried with them the knowledge of their own government's atrocities. They knew, either through direct participation or the pervasive whispers of a totalitarian society, that the state was capable of monstrous things in the name of public health. They knew that the Nazi regime had institutionalized the sterilization of over 400,000 German citizens. These were not enemies of the state, but their own people, men and women diagnosed with schizophrenia, hereditary feeble-mindedness, or severe physical deformities. They had been processed through genetic health courts and surgically altered to ensure they could never reproduce. This was the reality the German prisoners lived in. They knew that in the concentration camps, the horror was even more precise. They had heard the rumors, or seen the evidence, of the experiments conducted at places like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. They knew that doctors like Karl Klauberg were injecting caustic substances like formalin directly into the uteruses of women to block their fallopian tubes. They knew about the experiments with high-dose X-ray radiation used to burn ovaries, followed by the surgical removal of reproductive organs for study. They knew that the state viewed the capacity to reproduce as a privilege granted by the government, not a right of nature. So, when these men and women were captured by the Americans, they did not leave this baggage behind. They brought it with them. They projected their own regime's capacity for industrial cruelty onto their captors. But there was a missing piece to this puzzle, a specific element that transformed vague anxiety into specific, paralyzed terror. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, needed a way to ensure that German soldiers would fight to the death and that prisoners would remain loyal even behind barbed wire. They needed a narrative that proved the Americans were not just enemies, but biological threats. And they found their weapon in the history of the United States itself. The tragedy of this psychological warfare campaign was that it relied on a kernel of undeniable truth. The Nazi propagandists did not have to invent a history of American eugenics, because it already existed. They simply had to weaponize it. When creating the narrative that the United States intended to sterilize the Nordic race, Nazi intelligence pointed to the fact that federally funded sterilization programs had operated in 32 American states throughout the 20th century. They broadcast the fact that between 1907 and 1963, over 64,000 individuals had been forcibly sterilized under eugenic legislation in the United States. They highlighted California, a state that had performed approximately 20,000 sterilizations in state institutions, nearly one-third of the national total. They cited the American laws that targeted the mentally ill, the disabled, immigrants, and people of color. They even quoted Adolf Hitler's own pre-war assessment, where he remarked that the United States showed at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of citizenship regarding eugenics. This was the masterstroke of the propaganda. It created a double vulnerability in the minds of the German prisoners. First, they were conditioned to believe that state medicine was a tool for elimination. Second, they were presented with irrefutable proof that the United States had a legal framework for doing exactly the same thing. The propaganda message disseminated through covert channels, including the German Red Cross, was clear and terrifying. The United States had started with its own undesirables, and now it was moving to the second phase, the biological termination of the German enemy. When the Liberty ships filled with German prisoners of war began docking at ports in Boston, New York, and especially Norfolk, Virginia, the men inside were not just defeated soldiers. They were men waiting for the hammer to fall. They were arriving in a land of abundance, but their minds were trapped in a narrative of biological warfare. The processing of these prisoners was a massive industrial undertaking. Ships arrived, carrying up to 30,000 men a month. The United States Army, adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention, had established a standardized, highly efficient intake protocol. But to the German prisoners, this efficiency was not a sign of good logistics. It was a sign of sinister precision. Upon arrival at Norfolk, the men were marched off the ships and immediately subjected to the first stage of processing. They were stripped of their remaining equipment. Their Soldbuch, the 15-page German personnel file, was confiscated. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and assigned a prisoner of war number. Then came the delousing. The men were herded into rooms where they were sprayed with disinfectant, often DDT powder, while their clothes were taken away to be treated with methyl bromide gas or steam to kill lice and prevent typhus. For an American logistician, this was hygiene. For a German soldier who knew about the gas chambers in the East, the sensation of being herded into a windowless room, stripped naked, and gassed or sprayed was a psychological trigger of the highest order. Primary accounts from prisoners like George Fussell and George Kellerman describe these moments with a detached, administrative tone in their diaries, but the underlying tension was palpable. They were waiting for the gas to change from disinfectant to poison. From the ports, they were transported by train, often in comfortable Pullman cars that shocked them with their luxury, to camps scattered across the American South and Southwest. Texas became a major hub for these internment camps, with facilities like Camp Bowie and Camp Huntsville housing thousands of men. It was here, in the dusty heat of Texas, that the medical hysteria truly took hold. The flashpoint for this hysteria was the mandatory physical examination. The U.S. Army required every prisoner to undergo a thorough medical checkup. This was necessary for triage, to classify prisoners for labor details, and crucially, to identify contagious diseases, particularly venereal disease. The protocol required the doctors to examine the genitals of the men. In any other context, This would be a standard, if uncomfortable, medical screening. But seen through the lens of Nazi propaganda, it was the confirmation of their worst fears. The prisoners had been told that the United States intended to eliminate the German race not by killing them, but by preventing them from having children. They believed the Americans were waging a war on their progeny. When the American doctors reached for them, the prisoners did not see a checkup. They saw the sinister precision required for a clandestine mass medical crime. They interpreted the genital exam as the immediate precursor to surgical sterilization. This fear was enforced by the internal politics of the camps. Inside the barbed wire, hardcore Nazi officers often maintained a brutal control over the enlisted men. These trustees and officers enforced the ideological line that submitting to the Americans was treason. They framed the medical resistance as a battle for the survival of the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community. To drop your trousers for an American doctor was to surrender the future of the German race. The resistance was organized and widespread. American doctors and medical staff found themselves bewildered by mass refusals of medical appointments. They faced organized strikes where hundreds of men would refuse to enter the infirmary. The doctors, tasked with keeping the prisoner population healthy to maximize the labor force and adhere to international law, were suddenly fighting a ghost war against a rumor they couldn't see. The second front of this medical war was the vaccination program. The U.S. Army mandated routine immunizations for all personnel and prisoners, with a specific focus on typhus. The memory of typhus outbreaks in Europe was fresh, and the Americans were determined to prevent an epidemic in the camps. But the Nazi propagandists had successfully linked the typhus vaccine to the biological atrocities of the Third Reich. The rumors circulating in the barracks were specific and terrifying. Prisoners whispered that the shots were not medicine, but experimental disease agents. They believed the Americans were using them as guinea pigs, echoing the deadly live virus testing that Nazi doctors had conducted on inmates at Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Others believed the shots were chemical sterilization agents, a liquid castration that would leave them impotent and unable to father the next generation of Aryan children. This specific rumor mirrored the stories that had circulated among victims of the Holocaust, where women believed that chemical additives in their camp rations, such as the rutabaga soup, were responsible for stopping their menstruation. The German soldiers had internalized the idea that a state could and would use food and medicine to control fertility. Now, facing the needle of an American medic, they saw the fulfillment of that dark expectation. The situation was complicated further by the identity of the doctors themselves. The U.S. Army Medical Corps was a cross-section of American society, which meant that many of the doctors and officers treating the German prisoners were Jewish. For the German prisoners, indoctrinated for years to view Jewish people as Untermenschen, subhumans, and as dangerous biological threats to the purity of the German bloodline, this was a cognitive shock that often resulted in panic. The Nazi racial ideology had demonized Jews as the ultimate enemy. Propaganda had portrayed them as weak, parasitic, and incapable of leadership. Suddenly, these prisoners were confronted with Jewish American officers, wearing the uniform of a conquering army, displaying authority, competence, and power. It shattered the Nazi narrative in real time, but it also triggered a deep, instinctual fear of retribution. The prisoners projected their own guilt and the regime's hatred onto these doctors. They assumed that a Jewish doctor would naturally want revenge for the Holocaust. They believed that any pill given by a Jewish hand must be poison. This fear was so pervasive that Jewish doctors often had to hide their identities to ensure their patients would accept life-saving treatment. Dr. A.S. Goldsmith, a Jewish doctor from New York serving with American advance units, documented this phenomenon. He treated a young German woman for a severe case of pneumonia. The standard treatment involved sulfa drugs or penicillin, but Goldsmith noted in his records that he deliberately refrained from telling her he was Jewish. He knew that if he revealed his identity, she would likely refuse the medication, convinced he was trying to poison her. He chose to save her life, rather than claim the moral victory of revealing his heritage. In another instance, the dynamic was used as a psychological weapon. A Jewish medical aidman, tired of the arrogance of the wounded Nazi soldiers he was treating, deliberately told them while administering blood transfusions that they were receiving Jewish blood. He watched as the realization washed over them, a mixture of horror and helplessness, believing that their racial purity was being irrevocably tainted by the very life force keeping them alive. The fear of the Jewish doctor was not just paranoia. It was a reflection of the cult of the body that Nazism had instilled. The German soldier had been taught that his body belonged to the state, that his blood was a sacred vessel for the race. The idea of that vessel being punctured, injected, or inspected by the racial enemy was a violation that went deeper than military defeat. It was a spiritual and biological defilement. This psychological turmoil was not limited to the initial processing. It festered in the camps, creating a volatile environment that American authorities struggled to manage. The medical hysteria caused significant administrative friction. Resources that should have been used for the war effort or for the general maintenance of the camps had to be diverted to managing the conflicts arising from medical refusals. The American response to this panic was, largely, a rigid adherence to professionalism. There is no record of American doctors engaging in the mass sterilization that the Germans feared. In fact, the reality was the exact opposite. The United States adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, often providing the prisoners with better medical care than they had received in the German army. German doctors who were captured were often treated as colleagues by their American counterparts. They were allowed to assist in the treatment of their fellow prisoners. They were given access to American medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, including penicillin, the miracle drug that German medicine completely lacked. The contrast between the malice they were promised by Goebbels and the generosity of spirit they encountered in the American camps began to erode the propaganda, but it was a slow process. The fear was incredibly resilient because it was self-reinforcing. When a prisoner refused a physical exam and the Americans insisted on it, using force if necessary, the prisoner saw this as confirmation of the coercion. When the Americans mandated typhus shots to prevent a plague, the prisoners saw it as the mass administration of the chemical agent. We must also consider the perspective of the American personnel who witnessed this. For a young doctor from Ohio or New York, the sight of a grown man, a battle-hardened soldier of the Wehrmacht, trembling in terror at the sight of a tongue depressor or a stethoscope, was baffling. They did not initially understand the depth of the indoctrination. They were operating in a reality of logic and humanitarianism, while their patients were living in a reality of nightmare and conspiracy. At 9 a.m. on September 27, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel William Whaling stood at the edge of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. He was a seasoned officer, a man who had seen the mechanization of war, yet nothing had prepared him for this. He watched 4 Marines, their faces gaunt and stained with sweat and mud, carry a single stretcher toward the aid station. The body on it was covered by a poncho. But the story was already written in the slumped shoulders of the bearers. The terror was not confined to the men. As the war drew to a close and American forces pushed into Germany, they encountered the civilian population. Here, the fear of sterilization and abuse was even more acute among women. The propaganda had been vague but effective regarding civilians. The Americans were mongrels, gangsters, and rapists. But the underlying current of eugenic anxiety remained. When American troops liberated areas and set up field hospitals, they encountered women who would scream during examinations. These women had been living under a regime that had removed their reproductive rights, forced abortions on those deemed unfit, and encouraged breeding farms for the pure. They assumed the conquerors would implement a mirror image of this policy. The liberation of the concentration camps brought this dynamic into its sharpest, most horrific relief. On April 29, 1945, troops from the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions arrived at Dachau. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks and Brigadier General Henning Linden entered a world that defied medical logic. They found thousands of emaciated corpses and survivors who were barely clinging to life. Here, the medical personnel faced the ultimate test. The survivors were terrified of the very people trying to save them. At Dachau, American staff observed that inmates would fight against being taken to the showers. In the camps, showers had been the euphemism for gas chambers. The Americans, intending to clean the filth and lice from the survivors to stop the spread of typhus, inadvertently triggered the most traumatic memory the inmates possessed. Similarly, survivors were terrified of hypodermic needles. In the perverse medicine of the SS, injections were rarely for healing. They were used for execution, injections of phenol into the heart, or for sedation prior to lethal experiments. When American medics approached with penicillin to treat rampant infections, they were met with defensive terror. The tool of salvation looked exactly like the tool of murder. The tragedy of the medical hysteria is that it reveals the lasting power of a lie when that lie is rooted in a partial truth. The Nazi propaganda was successful because the United States did have a history of eugenics. The fear of the German prisoners was plausible to them because they knew what their own government had done. They looked at the American flag and saw a reflection of the swastika's biological ambitions. It took months, and in some cases years, for this fear to subside. It was not defeated by counter-propaganda or speeches. It was defeated by the mundane, day-to-day reality of survival. The prisoners eventually realized that the shots did not sterilize them. The physical exams did not lead to surgery. The Jewish doctors did not poison them. The high-calorie rations, the clean barracks, and the consistent adherence to the Geneva Convention slowly dismantled the narrative of the monster American. But the scars of that psychological operation remained. It highlighted a terrifying aspect of modern warfare, the ability to weaponize the history of an enemy against them, to turn their own laws and past failings into a source of terror for their captives. As we analyze the accounts of men like George Kellerman and the nameless women who feared the American clinics, we are seeing the result of a collision between two worlds. One was a democracy with a flawed but open history. The other was a totalitarian state that had devoured its own people. The friction between these two realities created a spark of terror that burned long after the guns fell silent. The story of the screaming woman in the Texas exam room is not just a story about a misunderstanding. It is a testament to the power of indoctrination. It shows us that when a government turns medicine into a weapon, the trust between doctor and patient is destroyed not just for a moment, but for a generation. It reminds us that in war, the battlefield is not just the land, it is the mind, and it is the body. The Americans eventually won the war of bullets and bombs. But inside the clinics of Camp WWII and the hospitals of liberated Germany, they had to fight a second war. A war against the ghosts of eugenics and the shadows of the gas chambers. Fought with patience, penicillin, and the slow, steady proof of their own humanity. To fully comprehend the depth of this hysteria, we must zoom in on the specific mechanisms of the propaganda that fueled it. This was not a rumor mill that started spontaneously among the prisoners. It was a top-down operation, orchestrated by the remnants of the Nazi command structure that continued to operate even within the American prison camps. Intelligence reports from the time, along with post-war analysis, reveal that the German Red Cross served as a key conduit for this psychological poison. Under the guise of humanitarian aid, the German Red Cross sent packages to the POW camps in the United States. These packages contained books, calendars, and seemingly innocuous religious journals. But inside the pages of these approved texts were coded messages and blatant ideological reinforcements. These materials were saturated with political warnings. They reminded the prisoners that they were still soldiers of the Reich. They warned against fraternization with the Americans, and crucially, they kept the fear of the Jewish capitalist alliance alive. They reinforced the idea that the American home front was a mongrel nation, a racial mishmash, incapable of culture or honor. This constant drip-feed of ideology ensured that even thousands of miles away from Berlin, the average German soldier was still listening to the voice of Goebbels. The camp spokesman, the leaders chosen by the prisoners to represent them to the American authorities, were often hardline Nazis. They used the information from these Red Cross packages to maintain an iron grip on the barracks. They were the ones who interpreted the American actions for the younger, less educated soldiers. When an order came down for a typhus vaccination, it was these leaders who whispered the word sterilization. It was these leaders who framed a sore arm from a shot as proof of chemical tampering. The resistance they fomented was not just passive, it was active and dangerous. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, the tension reached a breaking point. A prisoner, driven to despair by the atmosphere of fear and perhaps by discouraging news from home, deliberately walked into the dead zone, the forbidden area near the fence line. He was shot and killed by a guard. Was it a suicide? A desperate escape attempt? Or was it a final act of defiance fueled by the belief that death was preferable to the biological erasure he believed the Americans were planning? There were other suicides. Men who received Dear John letters from home, or news that their cities had been bombed, were already fragile. When you added the conviction that they were being medically dismantled by their captors, the psychological burden became unbearable. The medical hysteria was a force multiplier for every other trauma the prisoners faced. And yet, the American medical machine ground on. It is a testament to the logistical power of the United States that despite this resistance, the health of the prisoner population was maintained at an incredibly high level. The United States was determined to prove its moral superiority through its logistics. If the Nazis were the masters of death, the Americans would be the masters of supply. They flooded the camps with food. The prisoners, many of whom had been surviving on meager rations in the Wehrmacht, were suddenly eating better than they had in years. They gained weight. They recovered from wounds. And slowly, the cognitive dissonance became too loud to ignore. A government that wanted to exterminate them would not be feeding them steak and eggs. A government that wanted to sterilize them would not be spending thousands of dollars to fix their broken bones or cure their pneumonia. The virus of Nazi propaganda had exploited a weakness, the history of U.S. eugenics, but the cure was the overwhelming reality of American abundance and law. The propaganda claimed the Americans were hypocrites who were just like the Nazis. The reality proved that while the U.S. had its dark history, its conduct in the war was fundamentally different. This realization did not happen overnight. It was a slow thaw. It happened when a German soldier realized he had been treated by a Jewish doctor and was still alive. It happened when a prisoner realized that the sterilization shot he received 6 months ago had no effect on his body. It happened when they saw the American guards punishing their own soldiers for mistreating prisoners, a concept that was alien to the worldview of the SS. But the fear of the women, that was harder to erase. The women in Germany, who had not seen the inside of the American camps, who only knew the Americans as the bombers destroying their cities and the gangsters coming to occupy their homes, held on to the fear longer. For them, the medical exam remained a symbol of ultimate violation. In the end, the story of the sterilization scare is a story about the shadow of the eugenics movement. It shows how a bad idea, once codified into law in places like California and Virginia, can cast a long shadow that reaches across oceans and into the middle of a world war. The Nazis admired American eugenics, and then they used that admiration to terrify their own people into fighting harder. It is a stark reminder that the domestic policies of a nation are never truly just domestic. In a global conflict, your own history can be weaponized against you. The scream in the exam room was the sound of a woman trapped between two histories, the genocidal reality of her own nation and the flawed past of her captors. It was a scream that echoed the complexity, the tragedy, and the profound psychological damage of the Second World War, a damage that went far beyond the battlefield and settled deep into the veins and minds of a generation.